Thank you, Mr. President. Our great country has developed a dangerous habit when it comes to pandemics. Public health experts call it panic, neglect, panic. In 2007, after the emergence of the Asian flu, former Utah Governor Mike Leavitt, who was then the Secretary of Health and Human Services, put it this way: everything we do before a pandemic seems alarmist, Governor Leavitt said. Everything we do after a pandemic will seem inadequate. This is the dilemma we face, but it should not stop us from doing what we can to prepare, Governor Mike Leavitt. 15 years ago, then Majority Leader of the United States Senate, Dr. Bill Frist, told me, and he told our committee, he made 20 speeches predicting that a viral pandemic was no longer a question of if, but a question of when. Now, this is in the 2005-2006 area, 15 years ago. He recommended then, Dr. Frist did, what he called a 6-point public health prescription to minimize the blow: communication, surveillance, antivirals, vaccines, research, stockpile, surge capacity. 4 presidents of the United States, several Congresses, have done some of what needed to be done to prepare for pandemics, but not enough of it. There is substantial agreement on all sides about what to do. And there's even more agreement that if we wait until this pandemic is over to do it, we will fall into the familiar cycle of panic, neglect, panic. So the obvious thing, Mr. President, for this Congress to do now, this month, while we're in the middle of the pandemic, while we have our eye on the ball before we lose our focus, while we're spending $4 trillion or more, mostly to repair the damage caused by this pandemic, we should authorize and spend the few billions that it takes to be prepared for the next pandemic. That's why I'm introducing today the Preparing for the Next Pandemic Act. And that would take 3 of the most obvious steps about which there is near universal agreement. 1, make certain that we have and maintain sufficient manufacturing capacity within the United States to produce tests, treatments, and vaccines, so that we don't have to rely on manufacturing plants in China, in India, or any foreign country. Now, how difficult is that to decide, Mr. President? Do we really want our vaccines made in China, or India, or any other foreign country? So shouldn't we do something now to make sure that for the next pandemic, as well as this one, that we produce them here? Number 2, make sure that federal and state stockpiles have sufficient protective equipment, masks, gowns, ventilators, other absolutely essential supplies, so that we don't run out during this pandemic or the next one. Now, how controversial could that be, Mr. President? Do we really want to run out of masks, protective equipment in the next pandemic or in what remains of this one? And 3, create more authority for the federal government to work with private companies to maintain more supplies and manufacturing capacity for products that are needed during a public health emergency. We have the strongest, best, most creative private sector in the world. Why would we not want our government working with it as much as it possibly could to save our lives during this pandemic and the next pandemic? The Act also does the one thing that all of the experts with whom we have talked say is essential: make sure there's a steady stream of money for the next 10 years so there's no lapse in preparedness. I would propose that we do this with 10 years of advance appropriations. In other words, we appropriate this year $15 billion, spend it over 10 years, that's $1.5 billion a year, so Congress will be able to continue its oversight and make certain that our manufacturing plants onshore are kept up to date, and that state stockpiles in Alaska and Tennessee and every state and the federal stockpile are not depleted during tough budget times, which we know will surely come, just as surely as we know the next pandemic will come. Mr. President, on June 9, I released a white paper on steps I thought Congress should take before the end of the year in order to get ready for the next pandemic. I'm not a medical expert, so the main purpose of my white paper as chair of the Senate's Health Committee was to elicit recommendations to Congress from the experts that we could consider and act on this year. We asked the experts to get their ideas in by June 26. I asked for recommendations in 5 areas: tests, treatments, and vaccines. How do we accelerate research and development? Number 2, disease surveillance. Expand our ability to detect, identify, model, and track emerging infectious diseases. 3, stockpiles, distribution, and surges. Rebuild and maintain the federal and state stockpiles and improve the medical supply surge capacity and distribution. In other words, make sure we have masks and gowns and ventilators so the hospitals are ready if something happens. Public health capabilities. Improve state and local capacity to respond. Most of our public health is taken care of not here, but by our state and local public health departments. And then finally, who's on the flagpole? And that's improving coordination of federal agencies during a public health emergency. Our committee, the Senate's Health Committee, received 350 responses from leading public health experts around the country. They had many recommendations for short-term and long-term proposals to address future pandemics. As my staff and I reviewed these proposals and other feedback, I asked to focus on targeted ideas that would generate broad bipartisan consensus and help address some of the most pressing issues that we're facing today. That led us to 3 strategic areas. 1, sustaining onshore manufacturing. 22 responses mentioned that. 2, creating and sustaining the state stockpile. 23 mentioned that. Improving the federal stockpile. 24 mentioned that. These are recommendations from public health experts and bipartisan leaders who've convened the experts. Some of those from whom we heard included Dr. Frist, Governor Ridge, who's co-chair of the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, former Senator Joe Lieberman, co-chair of that same commission, Dr. Julie Gerberding, former director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Andy Slavitt, who during the Obama administration was the acting administrator of Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They all said basically the same thing when it came to these 3 priorities. So I introduced today the Preparing for the Next Pandemic Act in 3 parts. 1, onshore manufacturing provides new sustained funding, $5 billion over 10 years, that's $500 million a year, to maintain sufficient onshore manufacturing for tests, treatments, and vaccines, so that when a new virus emerges, we have a facility in this country ready to manufacture these products as quickly as possible. Number 2, state stockpiles. Provides new sustained funding, $10 billion over 10 years, that's $1 billion a year, so states can create and maintain their own stockpiles of supplies like masks and ventilators with help from the federal government. Now, this would be done with some restrictions, because what really happened before was a lot of the states and some of the hospitals, because they had budget shortages, they said, well, we can deplete our stockpiles and save some money. And so they saved some money, but when the next pandemic arrived, we weren't ready. The stockpile wasn't full, and people suffered because of that. And finally, federal stockpiles. This legislation improves the federal strategic national stockpile by allowing the federal government to work with private companies to maintain additional supplies and manufacturing capacity so we're even better prepared for the next pandemic. Now, there's more to do, Mr. President, to be ready for any future pandemic. But these are 3 steps that we ought to do right now, this month, as part of whatever COVID-14 Phase 4 legislation we can agree upon. At our Senate Health Committee hearing on June 23rd, this is what former Senate Majority Leader Dr. Bill Frist had to say about the need for sustained funding to better prepare for the next pandemic. Quote, "We do have to keep a revenue stream out there," Dr. Frist said, "that is dependable, that is sustainable, that is long-term, and that is flexible. What we're really dealing with is a rare but certain event," said Dr. Frist, "and the rarity is hard for Congress to deal with because of the attention span of Congress." And that's where it's important to have timelines that are 10 or 15 years out. Markets tend to look day to day, said Dr. Frist, and therefore this means we're going to have some sort of public funding that will guarantee a market over that 10, 15-year period when that certain event, that certain pandemic will occur. Now, there's precedent for what I'm proposing today. In 2003, Senator Judd Gregg of New Hampshire, in fact, he used to stand at this desk and make excited and well-informed speeches. And I used to sit right there and listen to him. One of our best United States senators. Senator Gregg was chairman of the same health committee that I'm chairman of today. He then recognized, 2003, the need for a clear, long-term commitment from the federal government to prepare for public health emergencies like COVID-19. That year, Congress passed what we call Project BioShield, with the leadership of Senator Gregg, of Congressman Hal Rogers, Senator Cochran of Mississippi, and others. The legislation provided $5 billion in advance appropriations to be used over the next 10 years to buy treatments and vaccines for threats like anthrax and smallpox. Reflecting on that experience in an editorial earlier this year, Senator Gregg wrote, "In this instance, Congress actually anticipated a serious issue and began addressing it effectively." Congress actually anticipated a serious issue and began addressing it effectively. Well, Mr. President, why doesn't Congress do that again? If it worked before, why don't we do it again? Why don't we make sure that the next time we have a pandemic that our manufacturing plants aren't in China or India? We can do that with a very modest amount of money compared to the trillions of dollars that we're talking about for other things. At our June 23rd hearing, speaking about federal efforts to build manufacturing capacity to respond to a pandemic flu, Governor Leavitt said, quote, "What I think we did not do adequately as a country over the course of time is maintain those manufacturing plants in a way that they were warm and could be stood up quickly." In other words, we've had this idea before. We supported building new manufacturing plants, but we lost interest in it. Panic, neglect, panic. And they weren't warm, said Governor Leavitt, when the time came that we needed them. Regarding stockpiles, Dr. Frist said, "We need, quote, not the incremental improvement of stockpiles and means of distribution, but the creation of great and secure stores and networks with every needed building, laboratory, airplane, truck, and vaccination station, no excuses, no exceptions, everywhere and for everyone." That's what Dr. Frist said at our hearing, and he said it 15 years ago. Former director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Julie Gerberding, said at our hearing, "In the face of an unprecedented public health crisis like the coronavirus, we have seen the strategic national stockpile deliver some promising innovations, but at the same time discovered areas where there is room for improvement. The COVID-19 pandemic provides us an opportunity to make pragmatic changes. We must act now to avoid becoming complacent and finding ourselves in the same position when the next pandemic occurs." Panic, neglect, panic. There is also broad agreement about some additional steps Congress needs to take to prepare for the next pandemic, including disease surveillance, restoring support for our state and local public health systems. Governor Leavitt said they've been seriously underfunded for the last 30 or 40 years, and better coordination of pandemic response. I don't propose to deal with those three things today, but I do intend to keep legislation to better prepare for future pandemics on the top of the congressional to-do list until it's done. In this internet age, Mr. President, attention spans are short. Even with an event as significant as COVID-19, memories fade. Attention moves on quickly to the next crisis. That makes it imperative that Congress act on needed changes this year in order to better prepare for the next pandemic, which might be in 20 years, or might be next year, or next month. The only thing we know for certain is that it will come. Let us not succumb to the familiar, dangerous habit of panic, neglect, panic. At least Congress can take these 3 steps to keep vaccine manufacturing on our shores and stockpiles supplied now while the pandemic has our attention, while we have our eye on the ball. I ask consent to submit for the record a copy of the summary of responses the Health Committee received in response to the white paper that I released on June 9th.
Without objection.
I thank the President. I yield the floor.